They laughed the first time they saw it, high above the war-torn skies of Europe, where speed and precision often decided who lived and who died. A new aircraft appeared. It didn't look like the others. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't built like the fighters that had already earned fear and respect in the skies. The P-47 Thunderbolt looked massive, almost oversized, like a machine that didn't belong in a dogfight. To experienced German pilots, it seemed slow, heavy, and predictable, something that could be outmaneuvered with ease, something that wouldn't survive long in real combat. And so, they laughed. But in war, laughter has a way of turning into silence, and that silence would come sooner than they expected. At first glance, everything about the Thunderbolt seemed wrong. Its wide body, its thick wings, its powerful radial engine that made it look more like a machine built for endurance than agility. In a sky dominated by fast, sharp-turning fighters, it appeared outclassed before the fight even began. German pilots, flying aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109, believed they had nothing to worry about. Their planes were lighter, faster in climb, and incredibly maneuverable. On paper, the outcome of any engagement seemed obvious. But war is not fought on paper. It is fought in chaos, in speed, in decisions made in seconds. And that is exactly where the Thunderbolt began to reveal its true nature. Because what the Thunderbolt lacked in elegance, it made up for in raw, overwhelming power. At its core was a turbo-supercharged engine, capable of maintaining performance at high altitudes where other fighters struggled. This wasn't just a technical detail. It was a strategic advantage. It meant the Thunderbolt could fly higher, faster in a dive, and strike from positions that gave it control over the engagement. Instead of reacting to enemy moves, it dictated them. It became the hunter, not the target. And once it started using that advantage, everything changed. Then came the moment that truly shocked enemy pilots. The first time the Thunderbolt opened fire, 8.50 caliber, machine guns mounted across its wings unleashed a stream of bullets so dense it felt impossible to escape. This was not precision fire. This was saturation. A wall of metal tearing through the sky. German aircraft like the Focke-Wulf FW-190, known for their strength and firepower, suddenly found themselves outmatched in sheer volume of attack. A single burst from the Thunderbolt could rip through an aircraft before the pilot even had time to react. Dogfights ended in seconds, and pilots who once felt in control suddenly realized they were not. But even more terrifying than its firepower was something far less visible: its ability to survive. The Thunderbolt was built like a fortress. Its radial engine could absorb damage that would instantly destroy liquid-cooled engines. Its structure could take hits and remain intact. And this changed everything in combat psychology. Because when a pilot knows their aircraft can survive damage, they fight differently. They take risks. They push harder. They stay longer in the fight. And Thunderbolt pilots did exactly that. Stories began to spread. Stories of aircraft returning to base with massive damage. Wings riddled with holes. Sections of fuselage torn apart. Oil leaking. Systems failing. And yet still flying. Still landing. Still bringing their pilots home. These stories weren't just impressive. They were terrifying to the enemy. Because they meant one thing: destroying a Thunderbolt was not easy. And in the middle of a chaotic dogfight that made it one of the most dangerous opponents in the sky, as the war intensified, the Thunderbolt began to take on new roles. It was no longer just a high-altitude fighter escort. It became a ground attack weapon unlike anything the battlefield had seen before. Equipped with bombs and rockets, it could strike targets below with devastating force. German convoys, tanks, supply lines, and infrastructure became targets, and the attacks were relentless. Fast, precise, and overwhelming. The battlefield itself began to change, because now danger didn't just come from the front lines. It came from the sky. Without warning, German soldiers gave it a name that reflected their fear. Jabbo, a term that quickly spread across units as a warning. When the sound of the Thunderbolt's engine echoed across the battlefield, it meant one thing: incoming attack. Soldiers would scatter. Vehicles would attempt to hide, but often it was too late. The Thunderbolt struck fast, unloading rockets and machine gun fire with devastating accuracy. Entire columns could be destroyed in moments. Roads became death traps, and movement during the day became a calculated risk. One of the most critical missions the Thunderbolt performed was escorting Allied bombers deep into enemy territory. These bombers were essential to weakening Germany's ability to continue the war. They targeted factories, railways, fuel depots, and key infrastructure. But they were vulnerable, slow, large, and heavily targeted by enemy fighters. Without protection, their losses would have been devastating. And that's where the Thunderbolt came in. Flying alongside these bombers, it acted as both shield and sword, engaging enemy fighters, breaking attacks, and ensuring missions could be completed. At first, German pilots attempted to exploit what they believed were weaknesses. They tried to outmaneuver the Thunderbolt, to force it into turning fights where it would struggle. And sometimes, those tactics worked. But the Thunderbolt pilots adapted quickly. They stopped playing by the expected rules. Instead of turning, they climbed. Instead of chasing, they struck from above. Instead of reacting, they controlled the engagement. And once that shift happened, the advantage began to disappear for German pilots. Asterisk as Allied forces prepared for major operations like D-Day. The importance of air superiority became undeniable. The success of the invasion depended not only on troops and strategy, but on control of the skies. And the Thunderbolt played a key role in achieving that control. Striking enemy positions behind the front lines, disrupting reinforcements, and weakening defenses before ground troops even arrived. By the time soldiers landed, the battlefield had already been shaped by relentless air attacks dot by the final years of the war. The transformation of the Thunderbolt was complete. The aircraft that had once been mocked was now respected and feared. Its impact was undeniable. Thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed. Tens of thousands of ground targets eliminated. Missions completed under extreme conditions. It had proven itself not just as a fighter, but as a multi-role weapon that could dominate both air and ground combat. And perhaps the most powerful lesson of its story is this: in war, perception can be as dangerous as reality. Because the greatest mistake made by German pilots was not tactical, it was psychological. They underestimated what they saw. They judged based on appearance. And in doing so, they gave their enemy an advantage that would cost them dearly. Because by the time they realized the truth about the P-47 Thunderbolt, it was already too late. What made this realization even more devastating was how quickly it spread across the front. Pilots talk. They share encounters, close calls, near-death moments. And as more German aviators returned from missions describing the same aircraft, the same overwhelming firepower, the same impossible durability, A pattern began to form. This was no longer an isolated threat. This was a system, a weapon being deployed at scale, and with every passing week, more thunderbolts filled the skies, turning what was once a curiosity into a constant, unavoidable danger. Asterisk, asterisk, the shift wasn't just in the air. It was psychological. Confidence began to crack. Missions that once felt routine now carried an edge of uncertainty. Because no matter how skilled a pilot was, no matter how experienced, facing something that could absorb damage, outgun you, and still dictate the terms of engagement, changed everything. Split-second decisions became even more critical. Hesitation became deadly, and slowly the advantage that German pilots once held began to erode. Asterisk, asterisk, Thunderbolt pilots, on the other hand, were gaining something equally powerful: trust. Trust in their machine. Trust that it could bring them home. And that trust translated into aggression. They pushed deeper into enemy territory. They engaged more boldly. They stayed in fights longer than others would dare. And that shift in behavior created pressure that the enemy could feel. Because now they weren't just defending. They were being hunted. Asterisk, asterisk, the skies over Europe became a battlefield of momentum. Not just physical momentum, but strategic momentum. The Thunderbolt, with its ability to dive at incredible speeds, turned altitude into a weapon. Pilots learned to use height as leverage, converting potential energy into explosive attacks. They would appear suddenly, strike with overwhelming force, and vanish before a counterattack could even begin. It wasn't just combat, it was control. And control is what defines victory in war. Not just winning individual fights, but shaping the environment in which those fights happen. The Thunderbolt did exactly that. It changed how enemy pilots approached engagements. It forced them to rethink tactics, to second-guess decisions, to operate with caution instead of confidence. And in war, hesitation is often the difference between survival and destruction. On the ground, the impact continued to grow. German supply lines became increasingly vulnerable. Fuel convoys, ammunition transports, reinforcements moving toward the front. All of them were now exposed. The Thunderbolt didn't just destroy targets. It disrupted systems. It created delays. It weakened the ability of entire units to function effectively. And over time, those disruptions added up, because war is not only won in moments of explosion and impact. It is also won in the slow breakdown of an enemy's ability to sustain itself. And the Thunderbolt became a key part of that breakdown. Every destroyed convoy meant fewer supplies. Every disrupted route meant slower reinforcements. Every successful mission chipped away at the structure holding the German war effort together. Pilots began to notice something else as well. The Thunderbolt wasn't just effective in one type of mission. It adapted. It evolved. One day it was escorting bombers at high altitude. The next, it was diving low over the battlefield, striking targets with precision. This flexibility made it unpredictable, and unpredictability is one of the most dangerous traits a weapon can have. Even the environment seemed to favor it. Bad weather, heavy conditions, long missions. Situations that pushed other aircraft to their limits were handled with surprising resilience by the Thunderbolt. Its rugged design allowed it to operate where others struggled, and that meant it could be deployed more often, in more situations, with fewer limitations. It became not just a powerful tool, but a reliable one. As the war moved closer to its final stages, the presence of the Thunderbolt became overwhelming. It was no longer just part of the Allied Air Force. It was one of its defining elements, a symbol of sustained pressure, of relentless attack, of a force that did not back down. And for those on the receiving end, it became something else entirely. A constant reminder that the balance of power had shifted. German pilots, who once dominated the skies, now found themselves reacting instead of leading, avoiding instead of engaging, calculating risk in ways they never had to before. The freedom they once had in the air was gone, replaced by caution, by awareness, by the understanding that at any moment a thunderbolt could appear above them, and that understanding changed behavior. It changed decisions. It changed outcomes. Because when a pilot hesitates, even for a fraction of a second, the window of opportunity closes. And in that closed window, survival disappears. The thunderbolt didn't just win through firepower or durability. It won through influence, through the way it forced the enemy to think differently in the end. Its legacy was not just measured in numbers or victories. It was measured in impact, in the shift of momentum, in the way it redefined what a fighter aircraft could be. Not just fast, not just agile, but strong, relentless, unforgiving. A machine that could take punishment, deliver overwhelming force, and still return to fight again. And long after the war ended, one truth remained clear. The aircraft that was once laughed at had become one of the most feared machines in the sky.